Now, Rod, have you ever heard of John P. Gatewood?
No, I haven't. But until I started looking up some information, I had no idea who this guy was. But then all I needed was to find a little bit of information about him, and I realized, well, heck, he comes from good old Fentress County, Tennessee, the place of a lot of famous people.
I think he's about the, what, we counted seventh or eighth story we've done from somebody from Fentress County.
Wow.
I mean, there's a lot of history up there. So, and this is a pretty interesting one. But you said a little bit of information. That's pretty much what you're going to get with John Gatewood. Just a little bit of information. There's one book written about him by a man named Larry Stevens. Been about 12 years ago. And then he's also included in a book called The History of the Rebellion in Bradley County, in which there's like a chapter about him and some of his stuff that he was doing. But he's a very interesting fellow. He was a Confederate bushwhacker or guerrilla, take your pick, who had actually ridden with Champ Ferguson for a while. So here's basically the story.
Okay.
Mr. Gatewood was born in Fentress County in 1844, 1845. The Gatewoods had come out of Virginia, where they had been tidewater plantation owners, growing tobacco many years before this. Some of the family members moved down to Fentress County and did quite well for themselves. Now, John was born around 1844 to 1845. When he turned 16, obviously, the Civil War started. And being a Confederate supporter, he joined the Confederate military under a lawyer from Fentress County who had his own unit. He fought with that unit at several battles in Kentucky and Tennessee, and at one point he got to missing his family, so he went AWOL to go back home to visit. When he got there, he found that Union soldiers had attacked the farm and had assaulted his sister. Sexual assault.
Not good.
That was not good at all, and that triggered something in him that went on for the rest of his life. He never returned to his unit. He went and joined Champ Ferguson's men and was part of that guerrilla unit.
Right.
And as part of that, there's some pretty bad things that happened. There was one incident where some soldiers, Union soldiers, were killed, and there were some prisoners left. There was talk about whether or not they ought to shoot the remaining prisoners because they'd be a burden on them. It turned back that, well, we don't have enough ammunition. We'd be wasting ammo to do that. And from what I've read, Gatewood just politely picked up a rock and bashed those prisoners' heads in.
Whoa.
Yes.
Whoa.
After a period of time with Champ Ferguson, he decided to go out on his own. So he organized his own group of bushwhackers or guerrillas, take your pick on what you term them, and headed down to around Chattanooga and North Georgia. And that's where he got a reputation as a wild bushwhacker. He was known, Rod, as the long-haired, red-bearded beast of Georgia. So that kind of gives you an idea of what we're talking about here. Yeah. And we did do, by the way, a short video about that that we put on Instagram and TikTok, and we've also put it here on YouTube. So if you've not watched it, go check it out and see. It's about 1.5 minutes long. It gives you a little background on John P. Gatewood.
You know, Steve, this also kind of reminds me of our talk, too, about, we've talked about Martin Van Buren Bates. You know, this sort of thing happened, the Union coming in, family, and so forth. He didn't go off as bad as what John P. Gatewood did, but man, when you told that just then about picking up a rock and bashing the man's head in, or bashing one of the prisoners' heads in, that's about as primitive and brutal as you can possibly get. But it's just like, you know, hey, we'll use some other ways. If we're not going to use the ammo and we can't afford to use the ammo, then let's just find a way to kill him. And that's what they ended up doing. And When you say wild bushwhacker, though, we're talking about some bad things when we're talking about wild bushwhackers. Am I correct?
There were some incidents, one of which was termed a massacre. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Okay. Uh, it's, Rod, just an idea of just how bad things like war are, but even worse than that are civil wars.
Mm-hmm.
Because this is something that people are inflamed about, and the enemy is the enemy. And that's, when you look at the enemy as less than human, you're going to do some of these things. And it happened on both sides. If the Union soldiers assaulted his sister, he's killing other Union soldiers, it back and forth, back and forth. But he ends up down in Georgia, and from Georgia, he's pretty much just bushwhacking around, attacking Union supply lines, especially any lines that involve Sherman as he's coming through Georgia, and harassing people in the area who had pro-Union sympathies. And I wasn't aware of this, but there were splits in sympathies in places like Georgia and southeast Tennessee as well, just as like they were up in other parts of Appalachia.
Wow.
So what he would do would be to go around to different farms and places where he knew there were Union sympathizers, call them out, and they would be threatened. While they're begging, don't do this, he would just take a gun out and shoot them in the face. Yeah, that's pretty much how that is. I think there were, 40 or 50 people he did that to, if I'm not mistaken. So in the fall of 1864, as the war is winding down, he goes on a raid into Bradley County and, more importantly, Polk County in southeast Tennessee. On that raid, he's doing these things that we've just described, but he runs into about, I think it's 5 men who are coming up from Fannin County, Georgia, heading for Chattanooga with the intent to enlist in the Union Army. His men just flat out massacred them. Now, I think one of them may have survived and told stories about how, they were playing dead, and his men were talking about, well, should we shoot them again to make sure they're dead or not? And they did, but still one of them survived, I believe. It was a brutal, very brutal attack. The Madden Branch Massacre is what that's called.
Well, Steve, is it possible that some of Hollywood may have used him as a kind of a prototype or an idea for maybe a movie? Because I'll tell you who I'm thinking of right off. I'm thinking of the outlaw Josie Wales. Sounds a lot like him.
Well, you never know. I mean, later on, he gets involved in stuff out west that we don't really know much about. But yeah, I could see them doing that. I really could see them doing that. He was something else. Now, I will say this, though. There was a town in eastern Alabama, right along the Georgia border, near Lookout Mountain, not too far from Fort Payne, that Union soldiers had gone through and had taken all the livestock from local residents in order to feed the soldiers,
right,
leaving those folks with nothing to eat. What Gatewood and his men did was they went to the stockyards where the Union soldiers had put all those cattle and freed them and headed them back over to Alabama. And that made him a hero to those folks over there.
Yeah.
And made him a wanted man by the Union.
By the Union, exactly.
In fact, this was right at the end of the war. This was like the spring of 1865. Not long after that is when Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox. And Gatewood knew he was going to be hunted down, so he takes off and heads west, intending, from what I can understand, to head to Mexico. Now, whether he made it to Mexico or not, we don't know, but the stories are that he did go to Mexico for a while, came back to Texas, and ended up dying in California in 1875, but none of that has really been confirmed. This book about Gatewood by Larry Stevens seems to indicate that from what records they've come up with, that he probably did sneak back into Texas under an assumed name and work for his brother, since his family had moved to Texas too. His brother had a cattle ranch, and he would get the cattle together and drive them up to Kansas where they'd be sold and then bring the money back down to his brother. In addition to that, he would gather up some other people's cattle and drive them up there. Cattle rustling, so to speak, and get paid for it and keep the money. And it was that second one that got him into trouble out in Texas. He had married, by that time, a woman named Mary, and they had a daughter named Emma. Apparently, Gatewood and Mary split up. John finds this other woman who's separated from her husband, and they start living together. He puts her up in a hotel room while he's doing these cattle drives, and eventually his wife gets tired of this, and she just divorces him, goes on to marry a Frenchman. When Gatewood comes back down to Texas, according to this story, he finds that the law is after him again, and so he takes off, and that's it. Nobody knows for sure where he ended up. However, years later, Mary Gatewood tells her daughter, Emma, that, Dad went to California and was killed in 1875, and that's how we got that bit of information, is from his daughter years later. But nobody knows for sure if that's what happened to him. There's other stories that say he died in 1898, other stories that say he made it into the 20th century, but nobody for sure knows. He's a very mysterious guy, Ron. Very, very little is known about him. Records just don't exist that much for him. It's a good story, and I wish there was more about it. That's one of the reasons we haven't done a full story for the audio podcast or did an official podcast. This is more like a recorded live stream, I guess you'd call it, about John Gatewood. And the reason I got interested in this fella is because back when we did the story about Devil John Wright, somebody left a comment about how this reminded him of John P. Gatewood, the wives and the girlfriends and all that.
Right.
And I didn't know who John P. Gatewood was. So I go looking him up, and I find this. And the more I find, the more I want to tell the story. But the more I look, the less I find.
Well,
it's very sparse pickings when it comes to John P. Gatewood.
You know, I find this interesting, too, that we were going to record this, but I was talking with someone today, and they weren't aware. Now, this was after the Civil War, but they weren't aware that people from the South, this part of the country and so forth, were sent to northern prisons. And when they were sent to northern prisons, they were sent up there not just to serve out a punishment or time or anything, but to, I don't know how I can kind of phrase this, sort of like to get a taste of what the Union really wanted to do to the Confederates, those that had pushed the limit a little bit too far. And, you know, a lot of times it resulted in deaths and so forth there in prison. But it was something that carried on after the war, too. I mean, there was this mistrust with people about, you know, are they really serious? Are they really, you know, are they this good of a person or whatever it might be? And, yeah, there was a lot of mistrust there, especially after the war, too. And, yeah, gosh, having the reputation of a bushwhacker, that's even... It's even more wild how you get on a certain path and you take that certain path. Like I mentioned Martin Van Buren Bates, and I mentioned him in this conversation that I had today with someone, and I said, you know, here he is, you know, family, you know, bunch of the family shot, you know, murdered and so forth, but He chose to go a different route. And then here this man is, he chooses to go a different route. And it's kind of sad, but it's very interesting, but it also tells you about, well, there are no limits, I guess, to how cruel and how inhumane human beings can be to one another in given situations.
Well, as I said, a civil war is probably the worst case scenario for anything. Mm-hmm. Anybody that has any romantic ideas about a civil war, you need to set those aside because it's brutal. So I'm not coming down saying he's a bad man or a good man. Right. He's just somebody that was in a really horrific situation and chose a way to go about it, dealing with his anger at what happened to his own family. A very interesting story. And again, I wish we could tell you more about him, but good grief, there's not much out there other than that one book. And even that book didn't have a lot. Now, one other thing before we go, and I had mentioned this to you, Rod, there's something else I'm looking at. This is one of two stories that I don't have a lot of information on, and I'm hoping that some of you may have some ideas about this. Rod, you've heard of Patrick Hagan, haven't you?
Heard of the name, yes.
Okay, Patrick Hagan was a very well-known lawyer in Scott County, Wise County, and Lee County.
Mm-hmm.
Came from, of all places, Dungannon, Ireland.
Ah.
Settled over here and helped to found Dungannon, Virginia.
Yes, and I think I know where this is headed, but I'm not going to say anything. I'm just going to leave it at that.
Yeah. Now, Mr. Hagan was a successful land lawyer, and he knew that coal was coming into the area, so he went and he would buy up tracts of land. At one point, he owned pretty much all of High Knob.
Wow.
And on top of High Knob, at one time, stood a hotel that he built. Called the High Knob Hotel. I'm wanting to tell that story, but I can't find any information whatsoever about it, either in newspapers, magazine articles. In fact, there's another person who has a blog, and I'm sorry I don't remember your name. It's been several months since I've spoken to you, but he sent an email that he was looking for the same thing and asked if I had anything, and I didn't either. I found 3 pictures that came off a Facebook page and a couple of articles talking about the hotel was going to be built, but from what I understand, it burned down sometime in the 1920s or 1930s. And there have been some people that have been up to an old site that's supposed to be the hotel site, but there's no discussion of what kind of hotel it was, who stayed there, its reputation, whether it had a restaurant or not, none of that stuff. But I would love to tell Patrick Hagan's story and the story of the High Knob Hotel. So if any of you out there have any idea about that or know some source that we could go to, let us know down in the comments. We'd love to hear that. And maybe you can help us put together a brand new story.
I'd like to know where some of these people came up with some of the pictures. I found a picture the other day of the old High Knob Hotel, and it looks like it's on a knoll, just, somewhere up on the, the mountain, and there's not any trees, but here is this freestanding structure sitting there, white. I mean, it's just it's a nice, it's primitive looking, yes, but that was the day and age when they built it and so forth. But then when you mention something about this, or you ask somebody, hey, does anybody know anything about the old High Knob Hotel? Not a lot of people know. And I don't know if this is just one of those stories that has been forgotten over time, or just not a lot of information was shared about it, because, we're not saying that anything illegal took place there. We don't know, because that's what we're wanting to find out. Did something, was something going on up there and so forth? But we do know what the demise was, and that was that it burned. And then there's never been another peep about it, never heard another peep about it. Seems like from the time that I first heard about it, I was like, who in the world would ever put a hotel up on top of High Knob? That was the first thing that kind of hit me. And There were people kidding years ago, wanting to go and kind of cash in on all the great stuff goes on in Western North Carolina with the ski slopes. And they were talking about, hey, let's put a ski slope on top of High Knob and everything like that. And it's like, it kind of died off after that. And I'm like, wonder why it died off. So there's another question.
Yeah, that's true. This whole thing with the High Knob Hotel, it's just, how you get something, Rod, that just sticks in your craw and you just want to find it and you cannot find it. I mean, it's literally, there's no newspaper articles about this. There was no newspaper article saying anything about it burning that I can find. It just some articles about Patrick Hagan's going to build one up there on High Knob, or it's getting ready to open, and that's about it. There's really just not much there. But it's a fascinating story, and it's a part of Appalachian history that I think deserves to be preserved and told.
I've got another one for you. Another one. It's around the High Knob area. I've always wondered how in the world High Knob, one portion of High Knob, got the name the High Chaparral. I've always known of the High Chaparral as a TV show back from the late 60s, I guess, is when it was on or something like that. But I'm like, why did they call it the High Chaparral? Beats me. I know nothing about it.
Wow, a mystery.
Yeah.
That's one thing I love to do, is try to solve mysteries.
Yeah.
Well, folks, we appreciate you sticking around and watching this video. Rod and I enjoy this. This is one of those off-the-cuff videos that we've done. We didn't have a script. We were just sitting here trying to talk a little bit and tell you a story. So leave us a comment down below. Give us a thumbs up if you like it. And be sure to come back and watch some more of our stories. Till next we meet, y'all take care. So long, everybody.
So long.